What, ma'am?
I think my brother is dead. His name is Daniel Taylor.
Detectives with the Major Case Squad tell me that 68-year-old Daniel Taylor was murdered. Police are confident that he knew the suspects.
I did not! I did not! I did not!
We're learning new information about a suspicious death in Collinsville, Illinois, when the Major Case Squad was called in to investigate after an elderly man was found dead inside of his home.
Stacy is the type of woman, I said it from day one, when she started working at this club, it was something about that woman. She was snaky, and like she just heartless, like a bitch that just don't give a And you'll hear her talking about her boyfriend, how he would kill somebody and all this. I mean,
how are you doing?
I wasn't allowed to change or anything, so.
You wanted to meet with us to tell us something?
Yeah, well, I wanted to straighten out some things with you. Because I think that you guys are hearing a lot of drama and gossip and BS, and I'm concerned about it.
Heish is doing something we call impression managing. She's taking control of the narrative. She's trying to control the outcome of the investigation. But what she's also doing is trying to manipulate the investigators. She's trying to build a bridge with them so that they see her as this innocent individual who's just trying to be helpful.
You know, I want to get this whole thing straightened out. I want to get it done with.
No, we do too. And this thing is going to get straightened out in a matter of time. I mean, forensically, we've got everything we need now. So it's going to be a matter of time before this thing is done.
Right.
And now we're hoping somebody decides they're going to cooperate with us before this thing gets out of hand. Did Danny ever give you money to spend time with him at all?
No, Danny didn't have money. That was the whole thing. Except for one certain time of the month, he would come in and he would spend a whole bunch of money and then he wouldn't have any money. All I know is I don't have a romantic relationship with him. Jesse has been to Danny's place with me. We were friends.
So there's no reason at all why, if the forensic lab comes up with any kind of fluids from either you or Jesse, why any of that would ever be in Danny's house?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Eva Heish has been not cooperating for a month. This person that she was friends with, she went to his house, and yet there's really no indication that she's sad about his death or curious about his murder. She does have an interesting insight into his finances, which most people wouldn't know.
That's a red flag because it's giving them a sense that she knows when he has more money and less money, and she's paying attention to that. The investigator is asking Heish, you know, there's no reason why we would find any of your fluids there, right? And her answer is not no, her answer is, I don't think so. She's leaving the door open a little bit later just in case she needs to tweak her story a little bit.
I mean, walk me through how many times that you guys have been there together, because this is new to me. And
I don't know when the last time Jesse was up there. And they said don't be gone too long, I'm out.
Yeah, we better get you back.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't.
You just can't get it out of your head.
I see the blood. I thought I saw part of his throat. I know I'll never forget what Jesse did. It's gonna be there. don't even think I could cut off a chicken's head.
That's something you never thought you'd ever see in your life.
I was close to somebody one time when they were murdered. When I was a kid, some guy got murdered in Tucson when I was on the streets. And even though I didn't see it, it affected me for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And my oldest kid's dad got murdered. And I remember walking in the house and seeing all the blood on the floor. And I'll never forget that.
Here, she's just describing all of these, what she describes as really traumatic experiences that she had with hardly any questioning at all. She's just freely offering this information. And that's so unusual in someone who's experienced a real trauma. She's offering up this information to really have a sympathetic view of herself, to say, I've been traumatized by murder before. I'm not someone who could possibly commit a murder. Don't pay attention to me.
Eva Heisch is someone who's been around law enforcement quite a bit. She has a very lengthy criminal history that dates back to her childhood and her adolescence. This is a woman who knows the legal system, she knows the criminal justice system, she knows cops, and she knows how to manipulate cops. Her choice of the tone she's using, the little girl semantics and body language, she's turtled in on herself physically. She looks like someone who needs protecting.
I wish I could have stopped it.
Did you try to stop him?
Yeah. I'm supposed to stop him just when he's mad. It just makes it worse. I hate him for everything he's done. He's tortured me.
She's hiding her face, and you can't see if she's crying or what sort of emotional expression she has. And it's interesting that she points out that there's no stopping Jesse when he's mad. But, why was he mad? They supposedly just went there to get gas money from this victim, according to her side of the story. So there's just a lot of parts of her interview that aren't really adding up and making sense.
Jesse seemed to snap that night. And I don't know why. I don't know what happened. If he confesses,
We're hearing a lot.
get out, right?
I would think, yeah. I would think that would be accurate, but I can't tell you what's going to happen. Well, let's get going. You don't need to put your purse on the thing for me. Turn around for me. You're under arrest.
Why am I
In
under
connection
arrest?
with the homicide involving Daniel Taylor.
Why?
Okay.
Why? Why am I under arrest?
Gaps without thinking about the fact that they can be verified.
Based on the things you've told me, you're not being fully honest with me. And that's not for debate, okay?
It's not that I'm not being honest with you. I don't remember a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
I've blocked them out.
Now she is using I blacked out, I don't remember, as a feigning of something very convenient to make blame go away from her. And when she's backed into a corner like she is right now, she's instead just trying to shut down and say, I have no information for you. I have no lies for you.
Daddy knew what was going on. He could tell Jesse's role and that I didn't have any part in it. He didn't try to talk me out of anything. He looked at me really sad a couple of times. Most
he's
times.
looking at you sad because he's believing you set him up.
Yeah.
Right, because that's what happened.
No.
Yeah, it is even.
No, it's not. I did not set up Danny.
Well, you didn't.
I just
you guys went
wanted
there
to
to get
borrow
money.
some money from him.
And you brought a psycho over there to borrow money?
Jesse was a psycho then. I thought Jesse was a different kind of person in the beginning. He misled me.
She contradicts herself in these statements in that she says, I was tortured by him, which suggests this is someone who's well aware of his potential for violence. But then she says that she had no way of knowing he would react to the victim the way he did. To the rest of us who live in the real world, who are not out to lunch, who don't double down on lies, This is not even believable.
He asked me
Does
if
he
I
know
knew
Danny?
anybody that we could get money from.
Okay. You guys never went there to Danny together?
No,
I'm sorry. You said that Jesse been to Danny's before. You're saying that's not true now?
Jesse had me go and talk to you guys. When I called you guys to come over to the club.
We know that. You think we didn't know that? I said it when we first got the phone call. We all sat back here and I said, yeah, we're getting probed. I'm not dumb.
But it wasn't me that did
Okay.
it.
And you were so calculated. You knew
I-
what you were going to talk about. You knew what you weren't. You knew from the beginning to the end. You were in charge. But you know what hasn't happened, Eva? One drop of tear coming out of your eye because you're too busy.
That's I sat there and cried that freaking night. And you know what? I'm just,
Where's the tears now, Eva? Because they're not coming out of your eyes.
they're not there because I'm so upset. How can you say that? I'm losing my mind or something? I'm losing my mind? You know what? I have seen Danny Taylor in my head over and over and over again. Don't tell me.
I don't know.
What are you doing to me? I don't understand. What do you want from me? You want me to cry again? Like I cried on the freaking day. I didn't want anything to happen to Danny.
But it did.
Really? I would have robbed somebody for $5.
She's even saying, hey, help. Basically, listen to me. Don't you want to hear about my story and how I'm not really the perpetrator of this? And when they're not listening, she becomes enraged. And that's something that we see in individuals who have psychopathic traits, is this inability to control emotions in the appropriate way and instead lash out, especially when they're losing control of the situation. And she's losing control.
Okay, well, I think we're done for now. You need to think about it.
I don't know what else to tell you.
Well, we may talk tomorrow. But
Well, look, you're trying to charge me with murder and I didn't kill anybody. I didn't stab him. I never did anything to hurt Danny. I couldn't watch him do it. I kept screaming at him. Are you listening to me? Help! Hey!
Sit in the chair. Don't.
I did not. 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 I didn't do anything to him! I didn't stab him! I brought him the knife! I didn't stab him!
What we see with Heish not getting her way in this interrogation and picking up chairs and screaming like an out-of-control 2-year-old in the size and power of an adult body may be some of what Danny experienced before he was killed. He didn't have any money to give her, and Heish didn't get her way, and we see what happens when Heish doesn't get her way. But in the end, this is somebody who doesn't value human life. She values her ego, and ultimately that is the biggest wound for her, is that this isn't working. People aren't seeing what she wants them to see. People aren't doing what she wants them to do. And Eva Heish doesn't know how to interact with anybody in her life except when they're compliant with her.
I've got a phone call that you said that you wanted to talk to us. Is that right?
I just wanted to make sure that you understood that, that I wasn't great debt to you, but I feel I owe my life to her. She saved my life. She got me out of jail.
All right.
She got me a paid lawyer. I would do anything this woman asked me to do. I want you to know that she was an equal partner in all of this. The intention was to get in there and get what he had. He didn't have any money. He had money.
Did she ever tell you why she thought that?
I guess because he spent money in the club. It was always about robbery, because she knew that he wouldn't. She knew that he probably wouldn't just give it to her.
Okay.
Danny Taylor was a 68-year-old man who lived alone, and he had health issues. Eva Heisch seemed to know this about him. She knew that he had enough money at least to go to the strip club however often he went. So he was a very vulnerable, but perhaps ideal victim for her because, in fact, he was older and he lived alone.
Psychopaths are often going to go for what's most readily available in their environment, the easiest thing they can think of. So if there's someone who's vulnerable and weak in their environment, they're going to capitalize on that and have no empathy. They're not going to feel bad about what they did. They're just going to take what they need from the weak person and move on.
Who gets out of the car first?
She did. When she walked down there, and I walked behind her, and I just let myself in once I realized she was in. She said she had the door locked. He like looked at her like, well, who is this? Like, what's going on? And she's like, just shut up and get on the bed and sit down. Where's the money at? Where's your dad? Don't make me make him stab you. When she said he didn't identify me, I had a knife in her hand and I just kind of dropped it and hit him.
Okay.
She picked it up behind me and stabbed him. When she did, I just grabbed it from her, you know, continued, stabbed him. I'm like, he's not moving no more, but she's like, she was make sure he's dead. So I put the pillow on his face and was trying to suffocate him. That's when she brought me in a little small butcher knife out. And that's when I cut his throat.
The credibility of Jesse Worley's story at this point makes sense. It not only fits the data that's available.
I believe that I was planning on raping them, you know.
Did you tell them?
Yeah, I told them that. That was the only way I could think of to get them out of the car. They just flat out refused to get out of the car. So I warned them, I said, look, get out of it. I'm going to have to shoot you right here.
How many times did you have to say that?
Well, I said it, 2 or 3 times, and that's to let them know that I was serious. I could have just said, hey, look, I'm a serial killer.
He was a sniper, carrying his rifle and scope in guitar cases. In St. Louis, he staked out a synagogue and gunned down Gerald Gordon. In Madison, Wisconsin, a young interracial couple. In Salt Lake City, Franklin killed 2 young black men who were jogging with white female friends. Even civil rights leader Vernon Jordan and Larry Flynt, infamous pornographer, founder and publisher of Hustler magazine, shot with Franklin's sniper rifle, but survived. So you hunted him down?
Yeah, I was hunting him down. Yeah, I ain't gonna deny that.
The single, unwavering drive in Joseph Paul Franklin, murder.
Just go out and kill somebody at random. I would never do that.
14-year-old Darrell Lane and his 13-year-old cousin Dante Evans were killed at random as they walked along Reading Road to a corner grocery store June 8, 1980. Franklin admits he was in the Cincinnati area the day before the murders, but he won't admit to the murders. Police still work on the case to this day, and they still think Franklin did it, but there isn't enough evidence to prove it.
He hates men. He would never talk to you. He said, but if you have a pretty assistant prosecutor, and I brought in Missy Powers.
I think men took the approach, if you send in a pretty face, they're going to confess. But I was hoping that you needed more than just that.
Franklin agreed to meet with Powers, but there were ground rules. No video, only a tape recorder, and no meeting on Hitler's birthday.
My name is Melissa Powers. I'm an assistant prosecutor here with Joseph Franklin. We're here to talk about the Cincinnati case.
Melissa Powers is brought in to talk with Franklin in the hopes that maybe they will catch him off guard. For narcissistic offenders and psychopathic individuals, the idea of having an attractive young woman come in to talk to him would have given him the sense that he was in a position of power and authority, and maybe a willingness, hopefully, to actually talk and share more about crimes he had done.
What can you tell me about that, Joseph?
Well, I did it. You know, the only thing I can say is I did do it.
And can you also tell me why you did it?
I was trying to get rid of all the ugly people in the world.
So here we have Franklin, who's been silent for 17 years about these crimes. And within minutes of talking to this female prosecutor, he starts to just unload everything, saying, I did it. I wanted to get rid of all of the ugly people in the world. The clear connection between...
I made another sniper kill that interracial couple there.
Okay, let me take you back. Let's talk about Cincinnati.
June was the most prolific. I was most prolific as far as murders go in that month. I committed 6 murders. Prior to that, I robbed a bank, 2.
Franklin's desire to talk about what he wanted to talk about not only was his narcissism at play, but his need to maintain control of the interview. Franklin decided that he needed to pump up his notoriety. Crimes are no good for a narcissist if you don't get credit for them. Look at how many of these crimes I've committed and never got caught for, and how many people I killed, and he says it with pride. The fact that he uses the word prolific, he's putting himself in a position of authority. He's not bothered by what he's done. He's getting a high off of it.
I was just getting very upset because the news media, the national media, wasn't covering what I was doing. They were pretty well suppressing the news. I just decided to just turn up the heat a little bit, just start committing more killings, just to try to force them to give me publicity. They finally began to connect the Vernon George shooting, the Cincinnati shooting, and then shortly afterwards I committed the Utah killings. That was good, you know. So I decided to just keep it up.
Very few things are as dangerous as a psychopath that feels rejected. It infuriates them. The only way he has to respond is taking all the anger and frustration that he's feeling and essentially kill more people specifically so he would get more publicity. He wanted the coverage and the grandiosity of being able to be the person on the news, even though it was for a horrible thing, but he was known and people were talking about him.
Was there any planning involved in the murder that you committed in Cincinnati?
Other than just going over my escape route. Yeah. I had to take that. It seemed like I had to sit there for at least an hour or 2. But finally, I heard somebody yelling and looked down there and saw a couple of dudes coming down the sidewalk, you know. I just put the gun right on the biggest dude first. And I fired 1 shot with that 44 Magnum. The other guy, as soon as he heard that shot, he just bolted and started running. And I aimed the gun, just hoping I would get a lucky shot. It was just like through a miracle that I got him, man. And I aimed the gun and hit him, you know. And sure enough, it actually got him.
He's talking about these 2 child victims as adults. He's depersonalizing them by talking about them as dudes. And the fact that he's referring to it as a lucky shot, it's also dehumanizing them. He's talking about them like they're target practice. It's not that they're someone's children, somebody's brother. It is a lack of caring about human life and compassion, but the predatory component is also thrill-seeking.
Did you I know in other ones that you told me about, you shoot the second one and you go back and shoot the first one.
Yeah.
Did you do anything like that in this one?
I believe I did shoot the first one again. Because after Larry Flint shooting, I just became very upset about killing Larry Flint. And now I regret actually even shooting it. It was really a tragedy. Just wanted to kill him really bad. I just considered if it was just one hour, I was a complete failure.
Larry Flint published in Hustler magazine a man and a woman that were interracial together. So because Larry Flint did something that Franklin essentially disagreed with, he thought he should die for it. In his mind, he failed. He called it a tragedy, but not because Larry Flint was wounded and paralyzed forever, but because he didn't kill him.
That's the thing about sniping. I never can tell where the shots are coming from, where you're at. So that's one reason it's so easy to get away with that type of murder.
But tell me about how long were you waiting? Or did you have...
I had the area staked out. You know, I would usually just stake an area out, just like Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Right.
The Rainbow killings were a little different MO because I just picked him up hitchhiking. Something I had not planned, you know. I guess maybe an hour or so's drive into West Virginia and saw them hitchhiking and decided to, you know, pull over and give them a ride. I got into the conversation with the one in the back seat regarding interracial dating and all this, and she advised me that she had dated blacks. So at that point, I decided to waste both of them and lure them out to the woods.
In his mind, these girls did something wrong. He wanted to kill that day, and no matter what they said, he was going to do it. But the MO is different, which shows that he's probably escalating in what he needed to achieve the same level of power and control, to get the same level of gratification from these crimes. Sniping isn't a very intimate experience. There's a distance. You don't really get to see the expression on the face as the people are dying. But killing somebody point blank, especially if they're begging for their lives, that's really when he feels the most power over somebody else's life and really has that grandiosity that he's so desiring.
It was a very isolated area, nobody around at all. I ordered them out of the car. They refused to do it.
Were you showing anger at that point?
No, I wasn't showing anger, no. You don't want to go around being angry because then you'll mess up things. I just led them to believe that I was planning on raping them, you know.
Did you tell them?
Yeah, I told them that. That was the only way I could think of to get them out of the car. I didn't want to tell them I was going to kill them.
He's really going through basic problem-solving strategies without any consideration for human emotions, for the fear these women must have felt. You see this total depersonalization of the victims. And when Franklin recounts what he did to these victims and how he terrorized them emotionally in those moments leading up to their death, he's callous about it.
They just flat out refused to get out of the car. So I warned them, I said, look, get out of it. I'm going to have to shoot you right here. You know, I could have just said, hey, look, I'm a serial killer. I will kill you if you don't get out.
Did they show any fear?
No, they didn't seem to, you know. When I realized they weren't going to move, I just went ahead and shot the one immediately right there in the front seat, you know.
And where did you shoot her?
Right in the chest. After I shot her, I pointed the gun in the back seat toward the other one and shot her in the head.
He had self-monikered himself as a serial killer, basically saying, well, You know, I just wasted them before I really told them the thing that would have very much scared them. But he's just writing this off as a loss. He got the kill, but that really wasn't what he was after. He wanted the response, and he was almost disappointed when they didn't show that fear.
Franklin really seems to like to stay in control of his victims, like many psychopaths, because it feeds into the idea that they are important and that they are superior. In this situation, when he encountered resistance of any kind, he just shot them to death.
Did you get any emotional satisfaction or anything out of killing either one of those girls or both of the girls?
It's not that you get emotional satisfaction. It's somebody you think should be wasted, you know. So I just went ahead and wasted them.
Okay.
It's not something that really turned me there just to get turned on or anything. To me, it was just, you know, something I had to do. It's a nasty job, but somebody had to do it. I enjoyed doing it.
Were you traumatized by it?
Not by that time, no. First one did. After that, I kind of got used to it. Anyway, I don't recall any sort of feelings I had at the time about shooting them. I just wanted to, you know, get rid of them. That was it.
He's saying it didn't upset me, it didn't traumatize me, because he was just doing his job. He was doing that unsavory task that needed to get done, even if it's not pleasant. That's consistent with a psychopathic individual who doesn't have normal connections to other human beings. This is a very predatory individual who gets his sense of self-confidence and station in life from deciding who lives and who dies. But there's a little bit of euphoria you hear in his voice. There's a chuckle. He is glib about how he's describing the crime, and that arousal does speak to some energy or adrenaline that he was experiencing both at the time of the crime, as well as now recounting it for this interviewer.
Franklin gets his pleasure from notoriety, not the actual act of killing, but being known as someone who does that. He's not saying, I regret what I did, I regret the harm that I put on these victims and their families. It's all about him.
Joseph, you've been on death row now for what, 16 years?
Yeah, about 16 years.
And now the execution date is drawing very near. What are your feelings with that deadline?
Well, I'm hoping to get a stay of execution. I would love to be out on the streets right now.
You realize you were wrong about everything you did?
About every single crime, every law that I broke. It was wrong. From robbing banks to carrying out murders. I've, you know, repented of my sins, asked the Lord for forgiveness.
It's not uncommon for psychopaths to sort of shift their identity and play off of what works in the moment. And at that moment, the thing that was going to work best for him was, I'm repenting, I see the light, I believe in God, and I'm asking God for forgiveness. Whether he believes any of that is completely disputable. He wants clemency, and he's trying to do anything he can to still play the fiddle and see what makes people dance. I guarantee you, if you asked him 2 days later and he didn't get what he wanted, he would take it all back.
I wanted to start a race war. That was my motivation.
When did you first get the urge to kill?
You're the first person who's ever asked me that question. When I was little, my mother used to make me and my brother stay inside all the time. Me and my brother Gordon could not go out and play ball with other boys, socialize. I think that stunted our mental development. He went crazy, actually crazy. One night I dreamed that I had killed my mother, you know. I was told that I was guilty of matricide, you know, murdering your mother. Mm-hmm. And so after thinking about it for a while, the dream was basically telling me that All the crimes that I committed during that 3-year period I was committing those crimes, I was basically striking back at my mother. That was my way. It symbolizes me getting back at my mother, killing her for what she done to me. You hear me?
While there's no doubt that early childhood trauma, emotional neglect, abuse are not optimal ways for a child.
It begins with a sound that no one remembers hearing, but everyone swears must have happened. A door shutting too hard, somewhere in the dark, sometime after midnight, in a quiet Ohio town that had learned to trust the silence. In 1991, silence still meant safety here. Streetlights hummed, porches stayed lit, and nothing truly bad was supposed to happen after dusk. That belief would not survive the night. By morning, the town woke to sirens slicing through the fog, the kind of sound that doesn't fade once it reaches your ears. Yellow tape cut across a gravel shoulder just off Route 47, not far from a bend most drivers took without thinking. A car sat crooked in the ditch. Driver's door open, engine cold. No skid marks. No blood on the road. Just absence, the most terrifying evidence of all. The missing person was 23 years old, young enough to still be called a kid by neighbors, old enough to be driving alone at night, returning home from a routine shift that ended later than usual. Friends described them as reliable, predictable, the kind of person who followed rules because rules made life simpler. They never missed a call, never vanished without explanation. That was the first thing detectives noticed. This wasn't a runaway story. This was a rupture. Inside the car, everything felt wrong in subtle ways. Wallet still inside, keys still in the ignition. No sign of a struggle violent enough to leave marks. The radio was off. The clock frozen at 12:41 a.m., likely from when the battery was disconnected, or when someone disconnected it on purpose. The trunk was empty, the back seat clean, too clean, as if the night itself had been wiped down. By noon, the word cold case hadn't been spoken yet, but it was already forming, like frost under the skin of the investigation. Officers canvassed nearby houses, knocking on doors, asking the same questions. Did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Most answers were no. A few were maybes. One neighbor mentioned headlights parked too long by the bend. Another recalled a car idling with no lights on. No descriptions matched. No plates remembered. Every detail dissolved the moment it was spoken. The community reacted the way communities always do. First with concern, then with fear, then with speculation. Grocery store aisles buzzed. Church parking lots lingered longer than usual. Parents walked their children to school even though nothing like this had ever happened here before. Especially because nothing like this had ever happened here before. Search teams spread out across fields and tree lines. Dogs traced scents that ended abruptly near the road, as if the person had stepped into thin air. Helicopters scanned from above, turning farmland into grids, forests into shadows. Days passed, then weeks. The missing posters aged faster than the people on them. Rain peeled corners. Sun bleached faces into ghosts. Detectives dug into routines, phone records, work schedules. No enemies. No debts. No secret life waiting to surface. The victim's last known call was ordinary, almost boring. On my way home. For words that would become unbearable to hear repeated. Then came the first strange detail. A witness who came forward late. Too late. A truck driver who claimed he'd seen a vehicle pulled over near the bend. Hazard lights blinking. A figure standing by the driver's side window. He couldn't describe the officer. Couldn't even be sure it was an officer. Just a shape. Authority implied by posture alone. The kind of thing you don't question when you're tired and driving past at 2 a.m. The idea hit investigators hard. An unofficial stop. An impersonation. Or something worse. Something official that went very wrong. Internal reviews began quietly. Too quietly. Records were checked. No patrol logged a stop there that night. No calls. No radio chatter. The silence thickened. Months later, A partial clue surfaced miles away. An item positively identified as belonging to the missing person, found near a rest area trash bin. How it got there was a mystery no one could agree on. Was it dropped? Placed? Was it meant to be found? Or was it a mistake that slipped through careful hands? The case shifted, reshaped itself around theories that never quite fit. Abduction by a stranger, targeted attack, accident covered up. Each idea carried weight until it didn't. Each lead promised answers, then collapsed under scrutiny. Files grew heavier. Hope grew thinner. By the end of the first year, the investigation slowed, not because detectives stopped caring, but because the trail had gone cold in the most complete way possible. No body, no suspect, no confession, just a car by the road and a town that could no longer explain its own reflection. Years passed. The victim's name became shorthand for loss. New officers joined the department knowing the story before they knew the streets. Evidence sat boxed and labeled, waiting for technology that hadn't been invented yet, for questions no one knew how to ask. The phrase, Ohio 1991 cold case, appeared in training materials, then in documentaries, then in whispers whenever another disappearance made the news. And every time, someone would say the same thing. Someday, this will be closed. Someday, the truth will surface. Someday, a routine moment will crack the past wide open. But standing there at the beginning, in the fog and flashing lights of that first morning, no one could have imagined how long the silence would last, or how ordinary the final trigger might be. A turn signal, a license plate, a stop that didn't matter, until it did. And somewhere in the distance, the road kept humming, carrying drivers through the bend without slowing down, unaware that beneath their tires lay the unanswered weight of a night that refused to stay buried. The road did not change after that night. It never does. Asphalt keeps its secrets well, absorbing tires, rain, and time with equal indifference. But the people did change. They began to look twice at passing cars, to listen longer to engines idling too close to home. In Ohio, in 1991, trust thinned quietly, the way fog lifts without anyone noticing until the air feels colder. Investigators returned to the bend again and again, measuring angles, re-walking steps, recreating a moment no one could agree had happened. The official report said vehicle found abandoned. The unofficial conversations said something else entirely. A stop that shouldn't exist. A presence that left no paper trail. Authority implied by silence. The kind of authority you obey before you realize you shouldn't have. They studied the shoulder where the car had been pulled over. No gouges. No footprints preserved. The soil had been disturbed and then smoothed by traffic and weather, as if the ground itself had conspired to forget. A crime scene without violence was harder than one soaked in it. Violence leaves clues. Calm leaves questions. The missing person's timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. Clock in, clock out. A quick conversation before leaving work. The gas gauge suggested they hadn't planned to stop. The route home was direct. No detours. No known reason to pull over. The implication hovered, unspoken but heavy. Someone else had made the decision for them. Police departments from neighboring counties were looped in. Names were run. Complaints were cross-checked. Any report involving a traffic stop near Route 47 was pulled and re-examined. There were a few, routine and dull. Nothing that screamed danger. That was the problem. Routine is camouflage. Routine is how you move unnoticed. A composite sketch was attempted based on the truck driver's memory, but memory is a fragile witness. Lines shifted, details blurred. The face looked like a dozen men who passed through town every day. The sketch went up on corkboards and into newspapers anyway. More symbol than suspect, a reminder that the case was alive even as it cooled. Then came the calls. Anonymous at first, a voice on the line suggesting a badge that wasn't earned. Another hinting at a fight gone wrong, a panic, a cover-up. Each call promised something, and delivered nothing solid enough to hold. Tips piled up like snowdrifts, impressive from a distance, useless when you try to dig through them. The family lived inside that waiting. Phones rang and hearts jumped. Doors opened and hopes surged, only to fall back into the same hollow shape. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. A chair remained empty not because it was reserved, but because no one could bring themselves to move it. The investigation drifted into a phase detectives dread. Maintenance. Evidence was preserved, files updated, leads checked just in case time had loosened someone's tongue. But time does the opposite more often than not. It teaches people how to live with what they know, how to bury guilt beneath routine. In the mid-90s, technology crept forward. DNA databases expanded. Old evidence was re-examined with new tools. Fibers from the car were tested and retested. Nothing sang. Nothing even whispered. The item found near the rest area was analyzed until it was reduced to facts that meant nothing without context. The theory of impersonation grew louder among civilians, quieter among officials. A fake cop was a story people understood. It made fear manageable. A real cop, or someone adjacent to that power, was something else entirely. That kind of possibility threatened the structure everyone leaned on. One retired officer, speaking years later, would admit that the case felt radioactive, not because of what they knew, but because of what they couldn't rule out. The absence of evidence cut both ways. It cleared everyone and no one at the same time. The town tried to move on. New businesses opened. Old ones closed. Kids who had seen the missing posters grew up and left. But the name lingered, resurfacing whenever headlights flashed blue in rearview mirrors, whenever a siren broke the night. Parents told their children to pull over only in well-lit areas, to call someone before stopping, to trust, but verify. Every few years, a renewed push brought the case back into the light. A new detective with fresh eyes. A grant that allowed overtime. A journalist chasing the long tail of an unsolved mystery. Each time, the same facts were laid out like bones. Each time, the same gaps stared back. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Not a confession, not a body, a pattern. A series of minor traffic complaints filed across counties, years apart, involving the same stretch of road, the same late hours, the same vague description of a stop that felt wrong. Not criminal, not provable, just wrong. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Then it didn't. The reports clustered around a window in the early 90s. They faded after, like a behavior that had been corrected or abandoned. Investigators traced names attached to those stops, cross-referencing duty rosters, vehicle logs, disciplinary files. The list narrowed not to a suspect, but to a possibility. One name appeared more often than the rest. Not in complaints, in absences, sick days taken without pattern, transfers requested abruptly, a career that bent rather than broke, someone who had worked nights, who knew the roads, who understood how a stop should look from the outside. Still, there was nothing to charge. Suspicion without proof is just another dead end. The file went back on the shelf, heavier now with implication. Years rolled into decades. The phrase "finally closed" began appearing in other headlines, other towns. Not this one. Here, the case aged into legend, a warning wrapped in a question mark. And then, long after most people had stopped expecting anything at all, the truth began to edge closer. Not with a scream, not with a breakthrough in a lab, but with paperwork. A routine audit. A review triggered by something small enough to ignore if you weren't paying attention. A traffic stop, somewhere else, involving someone else, that echoed a night from 1991 too closely to dismiss. The past doesn't usually announce itself. It waits. It watches. And when it moves, it does so through the most ordinary cracks. The road still hummed. Cars still passed the bend without slowing. But somewhere, in a file no one had opened in years, the silence began to fracture. The audit was supposed to be invisible, a procedural sweep, numbers checked against numbers, Dates aligned with dates. No drama. No ghosts. Just compliance. That was the lie everyone told themselves as boxes were pulled from shelves and spreadsheets flickered to life. The truth doesn't like grand entrances. It prefers fluorescent lights and tired eyes. The trigger was a traffic stop in a different county, decades later. Nothing remarkable on paper. A driver pulled over late at night. No citation issued. No warning logged. The officer claimed discretion. The driver claimed unease. The complaint was polite, almost apologetic, the kind that usually evaporates under bureaucracy. It didn't. Someone noticed the gap. A stop without a stop. Time accounted for without a record. A pocket of darkness where data should have been. The review widened. GPS pings. Vehicle logs. Radio checks. Patterns emerged not in what was written, but in what was missing. Minutes unaccounted for. Routes that bent away from assigned zones and returned without explanation. It wasn't criminal yet. It was curious. Curiosity is dangerous when it learns how to persist. The name surfaced again, not as an accusation, but as a constant. Transfers that coincided with complaints. Promotions that coincided with quiet. A resume polished smooth by time. A reputation described as steady, dependable, unremarkable. Unremarkable is how storms hide. Investigators pulled the old Ohio file. Not the summary. The raw material. Handwritten notes. Marginalia. The detritus of human thought. They lined up dates. They lined up shifts. They lined up weather reports and staffing shortages and overtime approvals. The night in 1991 stopped being a point in the past and started becoming a coordinate. They noticed the sick day. Not the one taken, but the one not taken. A swap arranged hours before a shift. A favor owed, repaid. A vehicle reassigned because another needed maintenance. A domino tipped by nothing more than convenience. The system didn't break. It complied. The bend on Route 47 was revisited with modern eyes. LiDAR mapped the shoulder. Lines of sight were calculated. Where headlights would fall. Where a person could stand and remain unseen by passing traffic. Where a badge, real or imagined, would carry weight. The model didn't prove anything. It didn't have to. It made the night plausible. Plausibility is the enemy of denial. They re-interviewed the truck driver. Older now. Slower to speak. Clearer about one thing he had never been able to explain. The posture. Not aggressive. Not rushed. Confident. The kind of confidence that doesn't ask permission. The kind that expects compliance and usually gets it. Internal affairs moved quietly. Too quietly for rumors to bloom. Files were requested under neutral language. For review. For comparison. The officer in question was retired now, living elsewhere. His life folded neatly into the anonymity that comes with age. He had outlived the noise. He had not outlived the record. They traced his route histories. They traced his vehicles. They traced the rest areas he favored, the gas stations where he refueled, the stretches of highway where complaints clustered like constellations. The item found near the trash bin decades earlier resurfaced in the analysis, not as evidence of guilt, but as evidence of movement, a breadcrumb no one knew how to read at the time. A warrant was discussed and deferred. You don't knock on a door with questions like these unless you're prepared for answers you can't put back. They needed leverage. They needed something that would force a choice. The break came from a ledger no one remembered authoring. Asset forfeiture records. Old ones. Paper copies with ink that bled when scanned. A seized vehicle logged weeks after the disappearance. Different county. Different case. The officer's name attached as secondary. The vehicle had been towed from a location that didn't make sense for the stop that justified it. The coordinates were wrong. Not wildly. Just enough. They overlaid the map. The coordinates hovered near the same network of roads. Near the same bend. Near the same silence. The vehicle had been released. The owner never complained. The record sat untouched for decades because it fit. Until it didn't. A decision was made. An interview framed as routine. 2 detectives, neutral tone, coffee cooling between them. The officer arrived on time. He smiled. He joked about paperwork. He recognized the Ohio case immediately. A flicker of recognition that lasted half a second too long. The room felt smaller. They didn't accuse. They asked him to walk them through a night from 1991. Weather. Shift. Memory is a treacherous thing. He volunteered details that weren't requested. He corrected dates that hadn't been misstated. He spoke with confidence until the questions narrowed and the air thickened. When they mentioned the bend, he leaned back. When they mentioned the trash bin, he paused. When they mentioned the unlogged minutes, he reached for water. None of it was proof. All of it was weight. The interview ended without fireworks. That's how these things go. You leave the room with more questions than you entered with, and the quiet certainty that you're closer than you've ever been. Closer is not enough. They dug into his past again, deeper this time. Financial stressors, disciplinary notes buried under euphemism, a prior incident dismissed as misunderstanding, a pattern of control that read as professionalism until you tilted the page. The family was notified that the case had movement, not closure. Movement. The word landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread through years of practiced restraint. Hope returned, thinner, sharper, more dangerous than before. A search was authorized for a location long dismissed as irrelevant, not because of a tip, but because of a convergence. The kind you don't see unless you stop looking for a single answer and start listening to the shape of things. Ground-penetrating radar rolled over soil that had grown old pretending to be ordinary. Anomalies appeared. Not a grave. Something else. Disturbed earth. A story interrupted. Forensics took samples. Tests were run. The results were inconclusive in the way that makes people angry. Inconclusive is a door half open. It invites the wrong wind. Pressure mounted. Media sniffed around the edges. Names were withheld. Phrases like routine review and historical interest filled the air. Inside the task force, the language was blunter. They were running out of places for the truth to hide. A second interview was scheduled, this time with a recorder that didn't blink. This time with documents laid out like a map of consequences. The officer arrived quieter, older. The confidence thinned. He listened as dates and times were placed in front of him, not as accusations, but as mirrors. He didn't confess. Not then. He deflected. He minimized. He suggested coincidence. Coincidence is persuasive until it isn't. The room pressed in. The silence grew teeth. Outside, the road hummed. Inside, a choice waited, not between guilt and innocence, between control and collapse, between the story he had lived with and the story that had been waiting. The past had found its leverage. It rarely needs more than that. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It settles into the corners of a room, into the pauses between questions, into the way a man shifts in his chair when the story he's told himself for decades begins to fray. By the time the second interview ended, nothing had been said that could be quoted as guilt. But something else had changed. Control had slipped. Investigators stepped back and widened the frame. When people don't confess, their surroundings often do. They pulled property records, old utility hookups, forgotten storage leases. They traced addresses not for where he lived, but for where he didn't need to be seen. A rented garage that existed for less than a year. A cabin listed under a relative's name, paid in cash. Utilities inconsistent, water usage spiking and then stopping. Places designed for pauses. Places designed to be temporary. They revisited the rest area where the personal item had been found, decades earlier, treating it not as a discard point, but as a waypoint. Surveillance didn't exist back then, but traffic patterns did. Toll receipts, fuel purchases. A timeline emerged that bent, subtly, toward the same vehicle, The same hands on the wheel, the same late-night movements justified by a badge, and a uniform that meant no one asked why. The theories shifted again. Not abduction by chance, not a random act, but escalation. A stop meant to intimidate. A conversation meant to assert authority. Something said that couldn't be unsaid. A moment where the driver realized the rules had changed. Panic doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like a decision made too fast to reverse. They brought in behavioral analysts who spoke carefully, clinically, about power dynamics and perceived threats, about how uniforms compress time, how compliance is reflexive when authority feels absolute, about how an encounter can tip from routine to catastrophic without a single blow being struck. The room listened. The family listened. The words landed like cold rain. A warrant followed, not for murder, not yet, for records, for storage, for the cabin. The searches were meticulous, almost gentle. No bones surfaced, no weapons, but absence again spoke too loudly. Bleach residue, where it shouldn't be. Soil disturbed and recompacted. A floor replaced without documentation. Repairs that made sense only if you knew what had been underneath. Then there were the notebooks. Old patrol logs kept privately, not required, not standardized. A habit some officers had. A way to feel in control of the chaos. Pages filled with dates and shorthand, routes and times, and gaps. Entire nights summarized in a line when others warranted paragraphs. The night in 1991 was there, just barely. A time window, a location coded, no narrative. They confronted him with the notebooks. He shrugged, called them meaningless, personal. He said memory fades. He said he'd worked hundreds of nights like that. He wasn't wrong. That's what made it dangerous. Patterns hide inside repetition. For the first time, the investigators pressed, not with accusations, but with inevitability. They spoke about audits that don't end, about records that cross jurisdictions, about how time doesn't erase, it aligns. They spoke about how the story had narrowed to a corridor with very few exits left. The family was brought in for a meeting they had imagined for years and feared just as long. They were told the truth carefully, with caveats and conditional language. No remains, no confession, but enough to say this wasn't drifting anymore. This was closing in. Outside, reporters gathered, catching fragments, building headlines out of verbs like re-examined and linked. The town watched, caught between relief and dread. Relief that something was finally happening. Dread that what was happening involved someone who had once sworn to protect. A third interview was scheduled. This one was different. It began with silence. It continued with photographs of the bend, the rest area, the cabin, the notebooks. Images are harder to argue with. They don't accuse. They remember. He spoke less. When he did, his words circled the truth without touching it. He admitted to the stop. Finally, he said it was routine. He said the driver was nervous. He said he let them go. The investigators didn't challenge him. They let the silence return. Silence is where stories die. Then they played the audio. Not from 1991. From years later. A dashcam recording from another county. Another night. His voice. The same cadence. The same phrasing. The same pause before a question designed to assert dominance. The room tightened. He stared at the table. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a fact he could no longer carry alone. He didn't confess to murder. He confessed to losing control, to saying things meant to scare that went too far, to following when he shouldn't have, to choices made in a narrowing tunnel of fear and authority. He said there was an accident. He said he panicked. He said he tried to fix it. Fixing is what turns mistakes into monsters. The legal language crept in then, careful and sharp. Statements were clarified. Counsel was requested. The interview ended not with closure, but with a fracture wide enough to see through. Searches resumed with new urgency. This time, they weren't looking everywhere. They were looking somewhere. Cadaver dogs alerted near a tree line long thought unremarkable. Excavation followed. Soil layers told a story of disturbance and repair. Something had been here. Something had been moved. No remains emerged, but something else did. Clothing fibers consistent with the missing person's car. A personal effect reduced by time but not erased. Enough to speak when combined with everything else. Charges were discussed, not the ones the public expected. Not yet. Abuse of authority, obstruction, false statements, the scaffolding around a larger truth. The case edged closer to the word everyone had waited decades to hear. Closed. But closure is a promise the past rarely keeps. As the news spread, the town felt the weight shift again. Not lifting, just moving. The road still hummed. The bend still waited. And the truth, now pressed into the open air, began to show how heavy it really was. Once the word spread, it didn't move like news. It moved like pressure. Quiet conversations stiffened. Old loyalties recalibrated themselves. People who had lived their whole lives trusting the uniform felt the ground tilt beneath them. Not violently, but just enough to make standing still uncomfortable. In Ohio, in 1991, a routine traffic stop had been absorbed into folklore. Now folklore was being asked to testify. Prosecutors assembled the case the way surgeons prepare for something risky and irreversible. Slowly, methodically, they knew what they didn't have. No body, no eyewitness to the final act, no moment captured cleanly on tape. What they did have was convergence, timelines that bent toward a single figure, behaviors that repeated across decades, and a confession that admitted everything except the word that mattered most. They built from the outside in. Abuse of authority wasn't a footnote. It was the engine. They demonstrated how power had been used not once, but habitually, how fear had been manufactured in small doses until it felt normal, how compliance had been trained into strangers who had no reason to question the voice issuing commands from behind flashing lights. The 1991 stop was reconstructed again, this time not as an isolated incident, but as the sharpest edge of a pattern. The driver pulled over because that's what you do. The officer approached with confidence because that's what he'd practiced. Words were exchanged. The balance tipped. Something was said that changed the temperature in the air. Fear spiked. Control slipped. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Longer than anyone would remember precisely. But not long enough to leave witnesses behind. The prosecution didn't need to prove malice. They needed to prove inevitability. That once the stop crossed a certain line, there were only bad choices left. And he chose the one that preserved himself. Panic, after all, doesn't care about ethics. It cares about survival. Defense attorneys countered with absence. Absence of remains. Absence of definitive cause. Absence of proof that the missing person hadn't simply walked away after being released. They leaned on doubt the way defense always does, widening cracks until the structure looks unsound. The town watched the arguments like a slow-motion collision. Every filing dredged up memories. Every motion reminded people where they'd been when the posters went up, when the searches ended, when hope learned how to live with disappointment. The family sat through it all, learning the language of law, because they had no choice. Probable cause, circumstantial evidence, reasonable inference, words that sounded clean and distinct compared to the mess they were meant to describe. They clung to the idea that truth, even partial, was better than the silence they had lived with for decades. Behind the scenes, investigators kept working. Cases like this don't pause for court calendars. They pushed the officer again, not with questions, but with consequences. Plea discussions floated. Cooperation was suggested. The offer was clear without being stated. Help us finish this, or let it finish you. He wavered. People always do at this stage. The certainty that once protected him had eroded. Friends had stopped calling. The uniform that once insulated him was now a liability. He spoke to his counsel in low voices. He asked what they could prove. He asked what would happen if he talked. What he wanted was control. What he was being offered was an ending. A supplemental statement came in fragments. Not a full confession. Never that. But enough to sharpen the picture. He admitted the stop escalated. He admitted he followed the vehicle when it pulled away too quickly. He admitted there was a confrontation off the main road. Somewhere darker. Somewhere chosen because it felt private. He admitted the person tried to leave. He admitted there was a struggle. He stopped there. Silence again. The kind that protects one last boundary. Search warrants expanded. New locations were added based on his movements that night, and in the days after. Investigators returned to areas once dismissed because they didn't fit earlier theories. Fields that had been plowed 100 times since. Tree lines altered by storms. Waterways that carried secrets downstream. They found traces. Not enough to make headlines. Enough to make sense. Soil samples that told a story of disturbance followed by haste. Organic material too degraded to identify conclusively. But present where it shouldn't have been. The earth, patient and indifferent, offered what it could. The media shifted tone. Finally closed, appeared in headlines alongside question marks. The public wanted certainty. The case offered none. What it offered instead was responsibility. A rare thing and not nearly as satisfying. In court, the officer pleaded to lesser charges. Obstruction, abuse of authority, false statements. The plea avoided a trial that might have unraveled under the weight of missing pieces. It also avoided the word everyone wanted to hear spoken out loud. Guilty of murder. That word remained just out of reach. Sentencing was somber. No victory laps. No applause. Just a judge reading from a list of consequences that felt both heavy and insufficient. Years, not decades. Accountability, not absolution. The gavel fell, and with it, a strange quiet settled over the room. Outside, cameras waited. Statements were issued. Officials spoke about restoring trust, about learning lessons, about systems that had failed and would now be fixed. The phrases sounded practiced because they were. None of them could answer the only question that mattered. Where are they? The family returned home to a house that had learned how to wait. The chair was still there. The silence had shape. They had gained a truth that came without remains, a justice that arrived without closure. It was something. It was not enough. Years later, when people talk about the Ohio 1991 cold case, they say it was closed. Technically, that's correct. Files were sealed. Charges resolved. The system moved on. But cases like this don't end. They thin. They fade at the edges. They become stories told with lowered voices and careful language. The road still hums. The bend still looks ordinary. Drivers still pull over when lights flash behind them, trusting that routine means safety. Somewhere in that trust, the past lingers, not as a warning shouted loud enough to hear, but as a memory you feel just before the engine idles and time slows. And in that moment, the truth is there, incomplete, undeniable, and heavy enough to last a lifetime. Closure arrived the way winter does in Ohio. Not with a single storm, but with a slow, numbing certainty that settled into bones and refused to leave. After sentencing, the cameras packed up, the headlines thinned, and the town returned to its routines with the awkward gait of someone relearning how to walk on familiar ground. Officially, the case was closed. Practically, it had only changed shape. Records were sealed and unsealed in turns. Appeals were filed, denied, filed again. The legal system moved at its measured pace, indifferent to grief, attentive only to procedure. Every motion reanimated the past, forcing names and dates back into the light. For the family, it felt like being asked to exhume the same memory over and over, only to bury it again without answers. Investigators didn't stop working. They couldn't. Cases like this teach you that the truth is rarely a single object waiting to be found. It's an accumulation, a pressure system. They revisited waterways first because water remembers differently. Sonar swept riverbeds where currents had rearranged sediment for decades. Dredging teams pulled up debris, bones that belonged to animals, scraps of metal, fragments of lives that weren't the one they were searching for. Each false alarm tightened nerves. Each negative result felt like another door, quietly closing. Attention returned to land. Not the obvious places, but the forgotten ones. Easements between properties, abandoned culverts, stretches of woodland marked for development and then left alone. Old maps were overlaid with new ones. Satellite imagery from the 90s was compared to the present. A patch of trees planted where there hadn't been any before. A depression smoothed out by time and leaves. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep hope alive in the most exhausting way possible. The officer was questioned again, this time without the pretense of negotiation. Prison changes the way people tell the truth. It strips stories down to what can still protect them. He was quieter now, less certain. He corrected fewer details. He admitted to moving something heavy. He refused to say what. He said he couldn't remember the exact location. He said memory is unreliable under stress. He wasn't wrong. He was also withholding. Psychologists called it compartmentalization. Prosecutors called it obstruction by omission. The family called it cruelty. Each label fit from a different angle. In the town, the conversation shifted. It always does once the shock fades. People began to ask how it had been allowed to happen, how complaints were buried, how audits missed patterns hiding in plain sight. Town halls filled with uncomfortable questions. Reforms were announced. Training protocols rewritten. Oversight committees formed. The machinery of prevention spun up too late for one family, just in time for the next headline that would hopefully never come. Former colleagues spoke anonymously. Some admitted they had felt something was off. A tone, a posture, a way of extending a stop longer than necessary. Others swore they'd seen nothing. Both could be true. Systems don't collapse because everyone fails. They collapse because enough people look away. A journalist picked up the thread, the kind who reads footnotes and follows them. They found a similar case in another state, another decade, another officer with a different name and the same habits. No disappearance that time. A driver who survived long enough to file a complaint. The details rhymed. The pattern grew teeth. The story reignited, not with rage, but with fatigue. Audiences had learned how to absorb horror in manageable doses. Still, the case cut through because it wasn't spectacular. It was mundane. A stop. A conversation. A choice. The scariest crimes are the ones that fit neatly into your day. Behind the scenes, a new lead surfaced, fragile and dangerous. A maintenance worker, retired, came forward after seeing the coverage. He remembered being asked, years ago, to fill a trench on private land quickly. No questions, paid in cash. He couldn't remember the date, precisely. He remembered the urgency. He remembered being told it was to prevent erosion. The land was identified. It had changed hands twice since. Permission was obtained. The ground was opened carefully, reverently, as if expecting an answer that might shatter what little balance remained. The soil told a complicated story. Disturbance, backfill, time. Roots had grown through layers that didn't belong together. They found remains, partial, fragmented. Enough. Forensics moved with practiced restraint. Tests were run, comparisons made. DNA, patient and exact, did what decades of searching could not. The result came back quietly, the way truths of this magnitude often do. A match. The family was called into a room that had held too many meetings like this. This time, there were no caveats, no conditional language, no careful hedging. The words landed clean and devastating all at once. We found them. Grief doesn't end when answers arrive. It changes temperature. The family moored a person they had been missing for decades, and a future that had ended the same night. Funerals delayed by years carry a different weight. They feel both overdue and premature. The officer was confronted with the evidence. This time, There was nowhere left to hide. He confessed to the accident, to the panic, to the decision to move the body, to the belief that time would erase what he could not face. His words were flat, administrative, confession as inventory. Charges were amended, sentences recalculated. Justice adjusted itself with the clumsy precision it always uses when catching up to the past. The word murder entered the record at last, not as a shout, but as a line item. The town gathered for a vigil that felt less like a ceremony and more like an exhale. Candles flickered, names were spoken, silence did what it had always done. Only now it carried something new, an ending that wasn't clean but was real. The road still hummed, the bend still waited, but somewhere beneath the ordinary noise of engines and wind, a chapter had finally closed, not with the satisfaction people imagine, but with the heavy dignity of truth found too late. And even then, the echo lingered, reminding everyone who listened closely that routine is only safe until it isn't, and that the smallest abuses of power can leave the longest shadows. After the remains were identified, time behaved differently. It stopped rushing and started lingering, stretching moments that should have passed quickly into long, echoing silences. The town discovered that answers don't erase questions, they rearrange them. Where there had once been a single void, there were now many smaller ones, sharper, more precise, each demanding to be faced. The recovery site became sacred ground overnight. Yellow tape returned, but this time it felt ceremonial, less a warning than a boundary between what was known and what would never be recovered. Investigators moved carefully, documenting soil layers, photographing angles of disturbance, collecting fragments that spoke and fragments back. The earth had kept its secret imperfectly. Roots had moved things. Water had taken pieces away. Time had sanded the truth down to essentials. Forensic reports followed, dense with terminology that tried and failed to sound neutral. Cause of death could not be determined definitively. Trauma was evident. So was haste. The conclusions were enough for court, but not enough for peace. They rarely are. The officer was transferred to a different facility, while proceedings expanded. His confession, now on record, was replayed and dissected. Analysts noted what he said and what he avoided. He described fear. He described losing control. He described the decision to hide rather than to help. He did not describe remorse in words anyone could recognize. Some people don't feel guilt the way others do. Some translate it into logistics. The revised charges moved forward. Murder, abuse of authority, tampering with evidence. Each count stacked, not just years but meaning. The courtroom filled again, heavier this time. The family sat closer together. The defendant sat smaller. The distance between them felt immeasurable. Testimony retraced the night with new clarity. The stop, the exchange, the pursuit, the place off the road where everything collapsed. Prosecutors avoided spectacle. They didn't need it. The story was horrifying precisely because it was ordinary. A conversation, a command, a refusal. A moment where power met panic and chose itself. The defense pivoted. They argued accident. They argued stress. They argued that fear had driven a series of bad decisions that should not be mistaken for intent. The word intent hung in the room like a blade. Jurors listened, their faces revealing nothing, their notebooks filling with lines that tried to make sense of the senseless. Outside the courthouse, conversations fractured along fault lines that had always existed but rarely surfaced. Some spoke about individual responsibility. Others spoke about systems, about how authority can distort reality when unchecked, about how a uniform can grant access not just to roads and stops, but to trust itself. Former officers testified too. Some admitted they had seen warning signs in hindsight. Others insisted the signs had never been clear. Both testimonies mattered. They mapped the gray territory where most failures live. The verdict came without drama. Guilty. The word landed and stayed. The sentence followed, longer this time, heavier. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to mark them. The gavel fell. The room exhaled. The case, at last, reached something resembling an end. Funeral arrangements were made with a careful tenderness that felt almost surreal after decades of waiting. Dates were chosen. Photos selected. The community showed up in numbers that surprised no one and comforted no one completely. Coffins closed chapters, but they also underline how long they've been open. At the service, the road was mentioned, the bend, the night, not in graphic detail, but as a presence that had shaped everything that followed. Grief was shared publicly for the first time, no longer restrained by uncertainty. Tears came freely, mixed with anger and a strange, exhausted relief. Afterward, life resumed its cautious rhythm. Children went to school. Businesses reopened. Patrol cars rolled through streets with an extra layer of scrutiny, an extra awareness that eyes were watching now in a way they hadn't before. Training sessions were updated, dash cams upgraded, policies rewritten. The future attempted to learn from the past. But history has inertia. The case rippled outward, touching other files, other departments. Cold cases were reopened not because of new evidence, but because of new courage. People realized that time didn't make questions inappropriate. It made them urgent. The journalist returned to the story one last time, tracing the arc from disappearance to discovery. The article avoided sensationalism. It focused on the small moments, a ledger entry, a maintenance worker's memory, a choice made in fear. Readers responded quietly. The comments section filled with recognition more than outrage. The family began the slow work of living again, not moving on, but moving with. Grief became something they carried rather than something that carried them. They visited the bend once, stood by the road as cars passed without noticing. The world hadn't stopped for their loss. It never does. But it felt different now, less mocking, more honest. The officer faded into the background of the system he had once navigated with ease. Appeals dwindled. His name became a footnote in training manuals, a case study stripped of personality and reduced to lessons. That reduction felt both necessary and insufficient. Years later, new officers would drive Route 47 during training, instructors pointing out the bend not as a warning shouted, but as a reminder spoken calmly. This is where routine failed. This is where authority went unchecked. This is why procedure matters. The road continued to hum. Seasons turned. Snow erased tire tracks. Rain softened edges. But memory held fast, anchored by the knowledge that silence had finally been broken, not by heroics, but by persistence. And somewhere between the certainty of guilt and the impossibility of full closure, the town learned something uncomfortable and enduring, that justice doesn't arrive all at once, that it limps, that it requires people willing to keep asking questions long after the noise has faded. The cold case was closed. The echo was not. In the years that followed the verdict, the case settled into the collective memory, like a scar that never fully fades, only lightens around the edges. People spoke about it less often, but when they did, their voices dropped instinctively, as if volume itself might disturb something still resting beneath the surface. Closure, it turned out, was not an ending. It was a condition. Training academies added modules. PowerPoint slides replaced grainy photocopies. The Ohio 1991 case became a reference point, cited without embellishment. A single traffic stop, a failure of oversight, a cascade of decisions that no policy manual could reverse once they had begun. Recruits listened, some nodding, some uneasy, all aware that the lesson was less about rules and more about restraint. The family changed, too, in ways no timeline could chart. They learned how to introduce their loss without explaining it, how to answer questions without reopening wounds, how to say the name without expecting silence to follow. Anniversaries became quieter, more private. Grief, once public and raw, learned how to live indoors. The bend on Route 47 gained a reputation without signage. Locals slowed unconsciously. Outsiders passed through unaware. There was talk, briefly, of a memorial, a marker, a plaque. The idea was debated and then set aside. Some wounds didn't need monuments. They needed space. Records requests trickled in from other jurisdictions. Scholars, journalists, civil rights attorneys. The case file was studied not for its drama, but for its mechanics. How authority slipped. How complaints scattered across counties failed to converge until decades later. How routine audits became the unlikely key to unlocking a truth everyone assumed would require a miracle. One study described it as institutional myopia. Another called it distributed responsibility. The family called it what it was: too many chances to stop something all missed. The officer's appeals failed quietly. Each denial was a paragraph, not a headline. Time in custody ground down whatever narrative he had left. He spoke rarely now, and when he did, it was to chaplains and counselors who measured progress in increments too small to matter to anyone else. Redemption is a personal project. Accountability is not. Cold case units across the state reported an uptick in cooperation. Tips came in. Old witnesses returned calls they had ignored years earlier. The Ohio 1991 story had shifted the cultural weather just enough to make silence feel less safe. That shift didn't solve everything. It solved something. In this world, that counts. A young officer, fresh out of the academy, pulled over a driver late one night not far from the bend. The stop was textbook. Lights. Radio check. Clear explanation. The driver thanked him afterward, unprompted. The officer would later mention it in a debrief, half joking, half serious. The supervisor nodded. Procedure protects everyone, he said. He meant it. The journalist wrote a follow-up piece years later, this one about aftermath, about how communities metabolize trauma, about how the most enduring legacy of a crime is often administrative, policies rewritten, databases shared, small safeguards added where none had existed before. It wasn't a dramatic story. It was a necessary one. The family attended one of the academy sessions, invited but not obligated. They spoke briefly. No accusations. No speeches. Just a description of waiting, of learning to live with not knowing, of what it meant when someone finally told them the truth. Recruits listened differently than they had to slides. At home, life continued in increments. Jobs changed. Children grew. New traditions formed around old absences. The chair was moved eventually, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement that the house needed to breathe again. Memory didn't leave with it. The bend saw construction. The shoulder widened. Drainage improved. Safety upgrades justified on engineering grounds alone. No press release mentioned why locals approved the funding so quickly. Years passed. New headlines replaced old ones. The phrase "finally closed" lost its immediacy, becoming a line in archives rather than a banner. Yet every so often, a story surfaced somewhere else that felt familiar enough to make people pause. A stop, a complaint, a pattern. The Ohio case lingered as a reference, a reminder that patterns don't announce themselves. On quiet nights, drivers still felt the strange awareness that comes when you slow without knowing why. The sense that a place remembers. Maybe it does. Maybe it only reflects what we bring to it. The case lived on not as a mystery, but as a caution about how easily trust can be misused, how slowly systems correct themselves, and how much persistence it takes to pull the truth into the light when it would rather remain buried. The road hummed. The town endured. And the echo, softer now, continued to shape the space between routine and reckoning, reminding anyone who listened that some closures are less about endings than about learning how to carry what remains. Time moved on the way it always does after the noise fades, quietly, without permission. The case slipped from front pages into syllabi, from candlelight vigils into footnotes. But memory has a way of resurfacing when routine falters, when something small doesn't line up, when a question refuses to stay buried. Ohio learned that lesson not all at once, but in echoes. Years after the verdict, a review panel convened with no cameras and no slogans. Its mandate was narrow: trace the failure points, not to assign new blame, but to understand how many doors had been left ajar. The findings were clinical: fragmented databases, jurisdictional silos, a culture that mistook quiet for compliance. No single switch flipped the night in 1991. A corridor of assumptions did. One assumption mattered more than the rest: that authority, when unchallenged, would self-correct. It didn't. It calcified. Complaints scattered across counties had looked harmless in isolation. Together, they formed a map no one had bothered to overlay. The panel recommended a fix as unglamorous as it was effective: shared records, routine audits, mandatory review of unlogged stops, paperwork as prevention. Boring, necessary. The reforms rolled out unevenly. Some departments embraced them. Others resisted with the language of tradition and autonomy. Change, after all, threatens comfort long before it threatens wrongdoing. But the case had left a mark deep enough to push momentum forward. Grants followed. Software was purchased. Training shifted from theory to practice. In classrooms, instructors told the story without names. A stop at night. An exchange that escalated. A choice to hide rather than to help. They paused not for emphasis, but for honesty. This is how it happens, they said. Not with villains twirling mustaches, but with people who decide, in a moment of fear, to protect themselves at any cost. The family watched these changes from a distance. They didn't campaign. They didn't lecture. They lived. That, too, was a kind of testimony. On anniversaries, they visited the grave. They spoke the name out loud, letting it exist without explanation. Grief had become a companion rather than a storm. Still heavy, but navigable. A new generation of officers took to the roads with better tools and clearer rules. Body cameras blinked red. Radios crackled with accountability. Stops were logged, cross-checked, reviewed. None of it guaranteed safety. It never does. But it narrowed the dark spaces where abuse had once thrived. Then, unexpectedly, the case reached outward again. A civil suit, not against a single person, but against the scaffolding that had failed to catch him sooner. Depositions reopened old wounds and older emails. Supervisors answered questions they had never imagined being asked. Why wasn't this flagged? Why didn't this rise? Why did silence feel easier than curiosity? The settlement arrived without ceremony. Money changed hands. Policies were amended. The family accepted neither as absolution nor as victory. They accepted because the system offered little else. Accountability, in this form, is transactional. Healing is not. Somewhere else, in another state, a tip line lit up after a driver recognized a pattern from a documentary rerun. Different road, different badge. The resemblance was imperfect, but it was enough to prompt a review. The Ohio case had done that, taught people what to look for when intuition whispered. That case didn't end in tragedy. It ended in paperwork and a reprimand. That counted, too. The journalist, now older, received messages from readers who said the story had changed how they pulled over at night, how they asked for names, how they trusted but verified. It wasn't cynicism, they said. It was awareness. The line between the two is thin and often misunderstood. In Ohio, Route 47 remained ordinary. No memorial, no marker. Snowplows cleared each winter. Rain slicked at each spring. Drivers passed the bend without knowing why their hands tightened on the wheel. Maybe they didn't need to know. Maybe it was enough that someone, somewhere, had learned. The officer lived out his sentence, measured in calendars and routines. He declined interviews. He wrote letters no one answered. He aged into anonymity, a cautionary example stripped of narrative, reduced to record. That reduction felt right. Stories can glorify. Records can warn. At a graduation ceremony years later, a class of recruits stood at attention as a speaker closed with a line that drew no applause. "Procedure is not bureaucracy," he said. "It is the thin line between authority and harm." The room was quiet. Quiet is where lessons land. The case did not disappear. It diffused. It became part of how decisions were made, how stops were logged, how supervisors listened. That diffusion was its legacy, subtle, persistent, real. The family drove Route 47 one last time together, windows down, radio low. They didn't stop at the bend. They didn't need to. The road had given what it could. They kept driving, carrying with them a truth that had taken too long to arrive and a future that would always bear its imprint. The hum of tires softened into distance. Night settled, and in the space between what was lost and what was learned, the cold case lived on. Not as a mystery, but as a measure of how far a community had come and how vigilant it would need to remain. The years compress into a blur of paper and dust, into file boxes dragged from basements and evidence rooms that smell like cardboard and time, and interviews replayed so many times the voices lose their edges and become a single low hum, and somewhere inside the hum the case breathes. Shallow, but alive, because it never really went away. It just waited. Detectives change, hairstyles change, laws change, but the name on the file doesn't, and every time it's spoken it lands with the same dull weight, the same unfinished echo, the reminder that this story refused to end when it was supposed to. A new team comes in with fresh eyes and old respect, not chasing glory, not promising miracles, just opening the box again and laying everything out on a table as if the truth might finally feel ready to surface. Photographs curl at the corners. Reports are yellowed. A map of the county still has pushbins stuck where patrol cars once parked, where search grids were drawn in pencil and erased by rain. They read. They listen. They notice the pauses no one questioned before. They circle the margins where someone once wrote, "Odd," and never followed up. A timeline is rebuilt minute by minute, not to be dramatic, but to see where it sags under its own weight, where it asks for answers it never got. A witness statement from years ago suddenly sounds different when read out loud in a quiet room. The phrasing is strange, the memory too precise in places and too vague in others. Another statement contradicts it by a few minutes, a few feet, a detail so small it was dismissed at the time, but now it flickers like a faulty light. The investigators lean in. They don't announce breakthroughs. They don't use the word suspect. They just keep pulling. A vehicle description resurfaces, not the make or model, just the sound. An engine idling longer than it should have. A door that slammed once, then opened again. Back then it was noise in the dark. Now it's a rhythm. Another thread appears in a forgotten call log. A tip that went nowhere because it didn't fit the theory everyone liked. It talks about a routine, about habits, about someone who is always there and therefore invisible, the kind of person no one thinks to look at twice. Technology catches up quietly. Evidence that once seemed inert is tested again, not with hope, but with patience. The results don't explode onto a screen. They arrive in plain envelopes, in numbers and probabilities, in cautious language that still makes the room go silent. It's not enough to accuse. It's enough to ask new questions. Old names are pulled from the file and lined up like photographs in a yearbook, and one of them doesn't look the same anymore. Not because of guilt, not yet, but because of proximity, because of access, because of opportunity that was hiding in plain sight. Investigators knock on doors they've knocked on before, but this time they don't ask the same questions. They ask why certain things were remembered so clearly and others forgotten entirely. They ask about that night without letting the conversation drift. They ask about the weeks after, about who changed, who moved, who suddenly avoided eye contact at the grocery store. The community feels it before it hears it. There's a tension in the air that doesn't have a name. People who thought this chapter was sealed feel it cracking open, and it makes them uncomfortable, because old cases don't just bring answers, they bring consequences. Conversations stop when certain names are mentioned. A family who learned to live with absent senses movement on the other end of the tunnel. A sound they've waited decades to hear but are afraid to trust. Investigators follow paperwork trails that lead to nowhere, and then suddenly somewhere. To a minor offense years later that puts someone on the radar again. To a routine stop that becomes a footnote until it isn't. They don't rush. They know the weight of getting it wrong, of reopening wounds without delivering truth. Every step is measured. Every assumption is challenged. The case refuses to be dramatic. It insists on being precise. Late nights stretch into early mornings. Coffee goes cold. Voices get hoarse. A timeline finally locks into place not with a bang, but with a click, the sound of something aligning after years of grinding. It's subtle, almost anticlimactic, and that's what makes it terrifying. Because now the story makes sense. Now the gaps aren't gaps anymore. They're bridges that were always there, just fogged over. The investigators sit with that realization longer than they need to. Because once it's spoken out loud, there's no going back. The cold case, the phrase everyone used like a label, starts to feel inaccurate. Cold implies stillness. This feels warm, alive, dangerous. They prepare. Warrants are drafted with care. Language is chosen like a scalpel, not a hammer. No leaks. No headlines yet. The case deserves better than spectacle. When they move, it's quiet. A door opens. A conversation begins. There's no dramatic confession, no cinematic collapse. Just a long pause where the past presses in on the present and refuses to be ignored. Details are corrected. Timelines are adjusted again, not because they were wrong, but because now they're complete. The person across the table doesn't look like a monster. That's the most unsettling part. They look like someone who lived among everyone else, who aged, who built a life while the case gathered dust. The truth doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives steady, relentless, impossible to shake. Outside, the town keeps moving. Cars pass. Stores open. People check their phones. And then the news breaks and the word finally does heavy work because it carries decades inside it. Finally closed. Finally answered. Finally acknowledged. For some, it's relief. For others, it's a new kind of grief. The realization that the waiting is over and now there's something else to live with. The investigators don't celebrate. They pack up files. They update records. They write reports that will be read by people who weren't born when this began. They know this ending doesn't erase the beginning. It just gives it shape. The family hears the details they've asked for, and some they never wanted. They learn where assumptions went wrong, and where instincts were right all along. They feel vindicated and hollow at the same time. The community looks back on itself, on the years of certainty and doubt, on the faces they trusted without question. The case leaves behind a residue, a reminder that time doesn't bury truth, it just tests how long we're willing to wait for it. And as the story settles into the archives one last time, it doesn't fade. It lingers, a low-frequency hum beneath the town's daily noise, the echo of a cold case that refused to stay cold, that carried its secrets forward until the moment someone finally listened closely enough to hear what it had been saying all along. It ends without fireworks, without the sharp punctuation people expect when a story has carried this much weight for this long. Because real endings rarely arrive with noise. They arrive with a quiet shift in the air, a sense that something heavy has finally been set down. The file is marked closed, a simple administrative act that feels almost insulting in its simplicity, as if a stamp and a date could contain decades of absence, decades of questions asked into empty rooms. The cold case is no longer cold in the system, but in the town, in the people who lived alongside it. The temperature is harder to change. Closure is a word that looks clean on paper and messy in practice. It doesn't seal anything shut. It opens a different door. The family walks out of a building they've entered and exited too many times, each visit carrying hope or dread or both. And now there's something new layered on top of the familiar ache. Answers have weight. They settle into the body differently than questions do. Questions float. Answers sink. They bring clarity, yes, but they also bring detail, and detail is sharp. Faces from the past come into focus with uncomfortable precision. Moments replay themselves with updated context. Conversations reinterpreted. Instincts revalidated or overturned. There is relief in no longer wondering who, but there is grief in knowing how close, how ordinary, how preventable it all feels in hindsight. Time does not soften that realization. It amplifies it. The investigators disperse back into their routines, into other cases that will demand the same patience, the same restraint, but this one stays with them. Not because it was famous, not because it was flashy, because it was quiet and long and stubborn, because it reminded them why they were trained to doubt easy answers and distrust neat narratives. In briefings and classrooms, this case will be referenced not as a triumph, but as a lesson about bias, about blind spots, about how certainty can become a trap, about how the smallest, most forgettable detail can outlast entire theories if you let it. They will talk about the routine traffic stop that finally shifted everything, not as a miracle, but as proof that no case exists in isolation. That truth can surface from the most unremarkable moments if someone is paying attention. The town absorbs the news unevenly. Some people nod and say they always suspected it. Others shake their heads and refuse to reconcile the image they held with the reality now presented. A name once spoken casually becomes weighted, retroactively heavy, dragging years of normal interaction behind it. Places take on new shadows. A street corner, a parking lot, a familiar route home. Memory reshapes geography, and suddenly the map of the town feels altered, as if invisible lines have been drawn between then and now. People look at each other differently for a while. Conversations hesitate. Trust recalibrates. This is the aftershock no one prepares you for. The communal reckoning that follows resolution. When a mystery stops being abstract and becomes personal, there is no universal reaction. There never is. Some feel vindicated. Some feel betrayed. Some feel nothing at all and are disturbed by that emptiness. The case had become a background noise for so long that its absence is disorienting, like sleeping in a room where a fan has been running for years and suddenly goes silent. The hum is gone, but the ears keep listening for it. Anniversaries pass without the usual speculation. News cycles move on. New crimes demand attention, but the echo remains, quieter now, woven into the town's identity. A story that will be told with less urgency, but more certainty. The person at the center of it all, stripped now of ambiguity, becomes smaller in the public imagination. Not mythic, not monstrous, just human. And that is what unsettles people the most. Evil that looks extraordinary is easier to categorize, easier to fear from a distance. This was ordinary. This blended in. This aged alongside everyone else. The realization lingers uncomfortably. A reminder that time doesn't just change victims and families, it also changes perpetrators, allowing them to occupy space unchallenged if the truth stays hidden long enough. Accountability arriving late is still accountability, but it carries the bitter knowledge of what slipped through the cracks. In the archives, the case file rests among thousands of others, its spine labeled, its contents finally complete. But completeness is relative. There are still moments no one can reconstruct, still thoughts that died with the night itself. No investigation, no matter how thorough, can retrieve everything that was lost. What it can do is draw a boundary around the unknown, give shape to the darkness, make it finite. That boundary matters. It allows memory to settle. It allows the living to redirect their energy away from endless speculation and towards something resembling forward motion. The story, told now, sounds different than it did before. It has an ending, yes, but more importantly, it has context. The early confusion, the missteps, the long silence, the the eventual alignment of facts all speak to a larger truth about how justice moves through time. Slowly, imperfectly, often out of order. This was not a straight line. It was a spiral, circling the same questions until perspective finally shifted enough to see them clearly. That doesn't make the wait acceptable. It makes it instructive. As the final reports are signed and the last interviews transcribed, there's a temptation to frame this as redemption, as proof that persistence always pays off. The reality is less comforting and more honest. Some cases are solved. Many are not. This one closed because of a convergence of attention, technology, and chance that cannot be replicated on demand. The routine traffic stop that unlocked it all was not destiny. It was circumstance. And that truth sits uneasily beside the relief, a reminder that for every story like this, there are others still waiting in boxes, still humming beneath the surface of ordinary life. Night falls the same way it always has. Streetlights flicker on. Cars idle at intersections. Somewhere, someone drives past without knowing they're crossing the invisible line between a before and an after that no longer exists. The cold case is no longer a question mark. It is a sentence with a period at the end, firm and final, but the emotional punctuation is more complex. It's a comma, a pause, an invitation to reflect on what it took to get here, and what it cost to wait so long. Years from now, someone will stumble across this story for the first time and feel the familiar chill, the pull of mystery, the shock of resolution. They will experience it compressed into minutes, into headlines and summaries and neat conclusions. They won't feel the drag of time the same way. They won't hear the silence stretch. They won't live inside the uncertainty. And that is both the power and the limitation of stories like this. They can be told, they can be understood, but they can never fully transfer the weight of waiting. The case is closed. The truth is known. And still, the town breathes differently now, as if aware that something long buried has been named and placed, not erased, just acknowledged. The cold case that once defined an absence now defines a memory, one that will linger quietly, not as an open wound, but as a scar, a reminder of what happens when time and truth finally meet, and of how long the distance between them can be. The story doesn't actually stop where the paperwork ends, because stories like this never do. They just change the way they breathe. After the headlines fade and the word closed settles into public record, the case continues its quiet work in the background of everyday life, reshaping memory, altering the emotional architecture of a town that thought it knew itself. People wake up and go to work the same way they always have, but there's a subtle recalibration underway, a constant, almost subconscious comparison between what was believed and what is now known. The past has been edited, not erased, and that edit ripples outward in small, intimate ways that never make the news. The family learns this first, in the days after the final court proceedings, after the last formal statements are delivered and the microphones are turned off. There's an unexpected silence that settles in. For years, the case gave their grief a direction. There was always a next step, a next theory, a next anniversary marked by hope or disappointment. Now there is only the absence itself, stripped of mystery, but no less heavy. They sit with photographs that feel different now, knowing what they know, seeing familiar smiles framed by a truth that was missing at the time. They replay moments not to search for clues anymore, but to reconcile love with loss, memory with reality. Justice, when it arrives late, doesn't replace what was taken. It stands beside it, an uncomfortable companion. In private moments, questions still surface, quieter but persistent. Why did it take so long? What if someone had listened earlier? What if a detail hadn't been dismissed? These questions don't demand answers anymore. They exist as reminders, cautionary notes written into the family's history. Healing doesn't follow a straight line. Some days feel lighter, as if knowing the truth has freed something inside them. Other days feel heavier, as if certainty has sharpened the edges of everything they lost. Both states coexist, and neither one cancels the other out. The investigators feel it too, though they rarely talk about it. This case becomes a reference point, a ghost that follows them into new investigations. When a witness hesitates, they remember this one. When a theory feels too neat, they slow down. When a minor inconsistency appears, they lean into it instead of stepping over it. The Ohio 1991 cold case becomes part of their professional DNA, not as a success story, but as a warning about complacency and the quiet danger of assumptions. In training rooms and late-night debriefs, it's mentioned without drama, without embellishment. Just facts. Just consequences. The town continues its slow, uneven processing. There are no town hall meetings about closure, no collective agreement on what the ending means. Instead, there are fragments. A conversation overheard in a diner. A pause when someone mentions a familiar name. A look exchanged between neighbors who now realize they shared sidewalks and seasons with someone capable of carrying a secret like that for decades. Trust doesn't collapse, but it thins. People become more observant, more aware of the distance between appearance and truth. The case doesn't make them fearful so much as reflective. It introduces doubt where certainty once lived, and that doubt lingers. Physical spaces hold onto the story in ways no one expects. A road feels longer. A parking lot feels smaller. A stretch of highway that once meant nothing now carries the weight of a routine traffic stop that quietly shifted history. There is nothing visually different about these places, but they are no longer neutral. Memory has marked them, layered significance onto asphalt and concrete. Even newcomers to the town, people with no direct connection to the case, eventually absorb its outline. The way long-term residents lower their voices when it comes up. The way the story is told without embellishment, almost carefully, as if respecting its gravity requires restraint. Time keeps moving, indifferent as ever. Seasons pass. New faces replace old ones. The case recedes from daily conversation, but it never fully disappears. It becomes a story told in context, a reminder folded into discussions about safety, about vigilance, about the limits of certainty. It joins the quiet archive of communal memory, not as a source of fear, but as a lesson learned the hard way. The phrase cold case no longer sounds abstract here. It sounds personal. It sounds earned. Years later, someone stumbles across the case filed digitally, scrolling through scanned documents and summaries, consuming in minutes what once took decades to unfold. They read about the missteps, the silence, the eventual convergence of chance and persistence. They feel a brief surge of shock, maybe admiration, maybe sadness, and then they move on. That distance is inevitable. Stories flatten over time. What remains vivid for those who lived it becomes compressed for those who didn't. And yet, even in that compression, the core remains intact. A reminder that truth can survive neglect, that it can endure being ignored, misplaced, underestimated. For the family, for the investigators, for the town itself, the Ohio 1991 cold case settles into something quieter than closure and heavier than memory. It becomes part of the landscape, a fixed point in time that informs the present without dominating it. It no longer demands attention, but it commands respect. The unanswered questions are gone, replaced by a known truth that carries its own responsibilities. To remember accurately, to question assumptions, to listen more carefully than people did before. There is no final image that neatly sums it all up. No single moment that captures what the ending feels like. Instead, there is accumulation, the weight of knowing, the relief of resolution, the discomfort of hindsight, the humility that comes with realizing how long the truth can wait, and how easily it can be overlooked. This is the real aftermath, the part that doesn't fit into headlines or court transcripts. The cold case is closed, but its presence remains, woven into the town's sense of itself, into the professional instincts of those who worked it, into the private grief of those who lived with its absence the longest. It stands as proof that time does not erase truth. it only delays it. And that delay has a cost measured not just in years, but in trust, in peace, in the quiet erosion of certainty. And as life continues forward, ordinary and unremarkable on the surface, the case rests beneath it all, not haunting, not forgotten, simply there. A reminder of what happens when patience, chance, and attention finally converge, and of how long the road between them can truly be. Even after everything has been said, written, archived, and absorbed, the case keeps whispering, not loudly enough to demand attention, but persistently enough to refuse disappearance. Time creates distance, but it does not create neutrality. The Ohio 1991 cold case lives on in the negative space of the town's routine, in the things people no longer say out loud, in the instincts they've learned to trust a little sooner than before. What once felt like an isolated tragedy now reads as a long, slow study in how ordinary life can coexist with buried violence, how silence can masquerade as peace for years without being challenged. For the family, memory becomes layered. There is the memory of before, when the world still felt intact, when absence had not yet defined the shape of their days. There is the memory of during, the long stretch of waiting where hope and resignation traded places, so often they became indistinguishable. And now, there's the memory of after, where the truth has settled in, undeniable and heavy, altering the way every previous memory is understood. They don't talk about the case as much anymore, not because it hurts less, but because it hurts differently. Grief no longer searches. It resides. Holidays come and go. Birthdays pass quietly. Milestones arrive without celebration. In these moments, the resolution of the case feels both present and irrelevant. Knowing what happened does not fill the empty chair. It does not replace the voice that should be there. It simply removes one layer of uncertainty, leaving the core loss untouched. And yet in small, almost imperceptible ways, the truth allows them to breathe more evenly. The endless mental rewrites stop. The what-ifs lose their grip. The story no longer fractures into infinite possibilities. It has an ending now, and that finality, however painful, provides a strange form of stability. The investigators carry their own private reckoning. Some revisit old cases with new eyes, wondering which ones might be waiting for the same convergence of patience and chance. Others feel the weight of responsibility more acutely, aware now of how easily critical details can be missed when pressure and assumptions collide. The Ohio 1991 cold case becomes a silent benchmark, an internal question asked during difficult decisions. What are we overlooking right now? It sharpens judgment not through fear, but through humility. In the broader system, the case sparks conversations that ripple outward, beyond the town, beyond the state. Policies are reviewed, procedures adjusted. Cold case units point to it as evidence that persistence matters, that revisiting the past is not an admission of failure but an act of accountability. Yet beneath the institutional language, there is an unspoken acknowledgement that no system is immune to blind spots. Progress comes not from believing mistakes won't happen again, but from recognizing how easily they can. The community continues its slow recalibration. New residents hear the story in fragments, stripped of emotion, framed as a historical footnote rather than a living wound. Longtime locals hear it differently, each retelling echoing with personal associations, with remembered faces and moments that no longer feel neutral. The story evolves depending on who tells it, but the core remains unchanged. A life was taken. The truth was delayed. The consequences stretched across decades. Places associated with the case become quietly symbolic. Not landmarks, not memorials, just ordinary locations infused with context. A stretch of road where traffic flows without pause. A building repurposed for something else. A parking lot repainted, restriped, its surface renewed while its past remains intact beneath the layers. These places don't demand reverence. They simply exist, reminders that history doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it blends, and so will it takes years to recognize its outline. As time pushes forward, the case begins to function less as a shock and more as a reference point. Parents mention it in conversations about awareness. Journalists cite it when discussing the limits of early investigations. Law enforcement trainees study it not for its drama, but for its delays. The narrative loses urgency but gains depth. It stops being about a single night in 1991 and becomes about the long arc that followed, the quiet accumulation of missed chances and eventual clarity. And still, there are moments when it resurfaces unexpectedly. An old news clip shared online, a documentary proposal, a passing mention in a broader discussion about unresolved cases. Each time, there is a brief resurgence of attention, a flicker of collective memory, followed by a return to normalcy. The case no longer disrupts daily life, but it subtly informs it, like a scar that doesn't hurt unless you press on it, but never truly fades. The truth, once revealed, does not demand